I bet you can imagine it. A motley looking group of cowboys gathered around a table in a Wild West saloon. One of them shows his hand and says, "Well, tarnation, a full house." But then another says, "Wait a minute, that varmin's got an ace up his sleeve." Punches are thrown, pistols fire, and men get thrown through windows, all to the sound of piano music. Well, what if I told you that that iconic American game originated from China? You probably wouldn't believe it, but it's true. Well, today on History Unpacked, we'll be taking you through the history of cards. We'll trace the origins of the game to their present form, and then for you enthusiasts of the esoteric, we'll see how this led to the development of tarot cards. Okay, so today we're familiar with cards having four suits: diamonds, hearts, clubs, and spades. But that's kind of weird, right? I mean, what kind of club looks like a clover? And what exactly is a spade? Is that supposed to be some kind of shovel? Well, the cards that we're used to today were created in France in the late 1400s. But then, where did the French get the idea? Well, prior to the French deck, there were several different styles of cards around Europe, and these partly reflected the culture they were in. Primarily in Germany, the clubs were actually acorns. I know you'd expect them to be clovers, but if you look at images of the acorns on old German decks, you can kind of see how this symbol evolved. Spades, meanwhile, were leaves. Okay, but why aren't they just called leaves then? Well, supposedly the leaf's meaning changed in other European countries to represent a spear, but the word spade comes from the Spanish word for sword, espada. At least that's what Wikipedia tells me, but I can't find anything to back that up. Okay, whatever. Anyway, the German suits were leaves, acorns, hearts, and bells. Well, I guess bells and diamonds are both small and shiny, but hold up. Why are the acorns called clubs? Aha! So, before the German decks were the Spanish and Italian decks, and here, instead of acorns, wands, or sometimes clubs, yes, like the kind you actually use to beat someone with, were used. Meanwhile, coins were used instead of bells, and cups were used instead of hearts. Why hearts instead of cups? Again, I can't find any source that I'm really satisfied with, but some people have suggested that the cups represented the clergy, while the coins represented the merchant class, the clubs represented the common class, and the spades represented the military. And you can sort of see a connection between the spiritual significance of the chalice and the heart, I guess. Oh, and the final suit of the Spanish and Italian cards? Swords. So there's our possible connection between the spades and the word for sword. Okay, so what do we know for sure? Well, we know that the Spanish and Italian decks were first, with their suits of coins, cups, wands, or clubs, and swords. And those evolved into other suits depending on region, but in particular were the German suits of acorns, bells, hearts, and leaves, which eventually evolved into the French version that we still use today. By the way, the Spanish and Italian versions, I'm told, are still used today also. But I don't know anyone who lives in Italy or Spain, so I'll leave it up to our commenters to confirm or deny. Now, another reason for the standardization of the playing card symbols was their ease of printing. Keep in mind that Gutenberg invented his printing press in 1455. Prior to that, cards had to be hand-drawn or painted, and reducing the complex images of coins, cups, etc. to an easier version was helpful for mass production. Great, so there you have it, right? But where did the idea of cups, wands, coins, and swords come from? Well, those came from the Middle East. See, in Istanbul, Turkey, there's a place called the Topkapi Museum. And in the late 1930s, a historian named Leo Mayer examined a deck of cards there that dates back to the Mamluk Empire. And he discovered that they're pretty much the same as the Spanish decks, except for the fact that they have polo sticks instead of clubs or wands. In fact, the game the Mamluks played with them was called na'ib, which is an Arabic word that kind of means lieutenant, and the Spanish word for a game of cards is nape or napes. I really had a hard time finding some of the pronunciation in this video, so apologies there. Anyway, there you go. All right, but then where did the Mamluk folks get their idea for playing cards? Well, that would be China. And this is where our trail goes cold, or maybe begins. In any case, the earliest reference to anything that could remotely resemble a card game comes from a piece of 10th century Chinese literature, which makes a brief reference to a princess playing something called the leaf game. Now, historians are unclear of just what exactly the leaf game was. Some think it could be a kind of dominoes game, others think it could be something played with big sheets of paper. But then, in about 1320, we have a document called the Dynastic Code of the Sacred Administration of the Great Yuan Dynasty, which says that in 17 July 1294, authorities caught two men playing cards, along with wood blocks with which to print them. And so that is the first instance I was able to find of people actually playing cards in recorded history. So you're probably wondering what early Chinese playing cards looked like. Well, these ones also had suits, but instead of wands, swords, leaves, or whatever, they only had coins. However, the suits were divided according to the groups of coins depicted on the cards: single coins, strings of coins, and groups of strings of coins. They put their coins on strings, which is why they have the holes in the middle, right? Anyway, they also sometimes had pictures of characters from a Chinese epic called Water Margin. And then came the Silk Road. From there, the Chinese cards traveled to the Middle East, where the polo sticks, cups, and swords replaced the groups of coins, and then they moved to Spain and Italy, who replaced the polo sticks with wands and clubs, then Germany, which changed the clubs to acorns, the swords to leaves, and the cups to hearts. Finally, it went to France, which changed leaves to spades and coins to diamonds, while also making the card design more print-friendly. I should also mention that Europe wasn't the only place cards spread to. They also went from the Middle East to India, where they evolved into the game known as Ganjifa, which uses disc-shaped cards. Now, you're probably wondering about the face cards, though, right? The king, queen, etc. Well, those have been around since the beginning, pretty much. You remember how I mentioned that some of the Chinese cards had literary characters on them, right? Well, in the Mamluk cards, those changed to a variety of rulers. When cards made it to Europe, obviously, they had to change them to something more identifiable to their region, so they made them into ones that reflected the rulers of Europe. So now we know where the king and queen came from. And by the way, the queen was also a later addition. Originally, there were only male characters in the playing card deck. But what the heck is a jack? Well, originally, there were knights and knaves in some versions, knaves representing the common man. In fact, you can see this from the character of the Knave of Hearts in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. But people thought that two KN words was too confusing, so the knave was turned into a jack, which was basically a word at the time that meant dude or guy. Well, what about the ace? Why isn't that called a one? Well, my AI assistant tells me that this comes from Old French or Latin for one, but I had a hard time verifying this from a reliable source. A search on Google Translate, though, does reveal that assis does seem to be a name for a kind of coin in Latin, so this does seem to have some truth to it. Well, so then what about the Joker? That was apparently introduced for the game of euchre. Now, I used to play euchre a lot back home, and we never used a joker, but I guess there were some variations that used a blank card included in the pack as the highest card in the game, and over time the popularity of this variant led to an actual card, which somehow evolved into a joker. Actually, it's really unclear as to why the theme or even word joker was used. Some think it was due to the name of a German card game called Euchrespiel, which many, in turn, think was the game that euchre evolved from. But while Spiel means game, euchre doesn't seem to mean anything. Some people postulate that it was a regional dialect for jack, but don't know. So that's a quick overview of how three different cultures all contributed to the development of a product that we all know and love. But one country wasn't ready to jump on the playing card bandwagon. While playing cards were busy evolving west of the Pacific, Japan was cutting itself off from the rest of the world. For this reason, they ended up creating their own version of playing cards, known as Hanafuda, which are still used in Japan and Korea to this day, alongside their Western counterparts, but often much more frequently. Whew. All right, so that's playing cards. But what about tarot cards? Is there any connection? Yes. Now, as some know, the tarot cards we typically think of, the Fool, the Wheel of Fortune, Death, etc., are not the entirety of the tarot deck. Those cards are called the Major Arcana. But there are also cards called the Minor Arcana, and these use suits similar to the European decks: wands, cups, swords, and the like, because originally these cards were used for an Italian game called Tarocini. A lot of the major arcana cards were themes that would have appeared in festivals and processions during medieval times, like the Feast of Fools, which we talk about in our episode on clowns. But during the 18th and 19th centuries, there was this sudden interest in mysticism and the occult. In particular, Jean-Baptiste Allier, or Ateia, came up with the idea that cards could be used for divination, or cartomancy, making him one of the first tarot card readers. Later, his ideas were expanded upon by people like Antoine Court and Alpheus Levi, who postulated that tarot cards were the remnants of secret, encrypted ancient Egyptian knowledge. Now, every source I've researched on this all points out that there is no evidence to back this up, meaning that tarot readings are no more accurate than tea leaf reading, haruspicy, or what have you. Sorry, tarot card enthusiasts, that's what my research showed. Anyway, nonetheless, it was enough to get tarot cards recognized by occultists, and eventually members of the club known as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn standardized the tarot cards with their Rider-Waite-Smith deck, named after its creators, and which is still the typical deck to this day. By the way, for more information on the arcane, check out our episode on magic. And that is the whole history of cards. So, now the next time you're playing three card Monty in a back alley in a desperate attempt to win enough money to pay off those gangsters so they don't cut off another finger, take a moment to look at the cards and appreciate their long journey and history. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.